Hello, I am Dr. Azal from medicovisual.com, and in today's visual lecture we will discuss the development of sweat glands. We have basically two types of sweat glands, but before discussing the sweat glands, I have to discuss a very important concept that is very well related with the sweat glands, and the concept is about the modes of secretion of glands in general, not specifically about the sweat glands, but generally I will briefly talk about the modes of secretion of the glands, because this will help you understand the difference between two types of sweat glands that we will just discuss in this lecture. So imagine here we have a cell and the secretory product that the cell has to release. These are packed into these special membrane bound vesicles, and then they are to be released outside this secretory cell of a gland. Now, this is a single cell being shown here. Of course, this mechanism will be going on in many cells, in of almost all the secretory cells of the gland. So basically, I have not shown the details here because that would be beyond the scope of this lecture, but these vesicles, they are packed by the Golgi apparatus, and then right now they are in the cytoplasm, right? Please understand this thing that secretory products, these are not directly floating within the cytoplasm. Rather, they are membrane bound vesicle. They are inside the secretory product. They are inside these membrane bound vesicles. Now, what the cell will do is that it will release these membrane bound vesicles outside the cell like this. So what is actually happening is that this process is called exocytosis. To understand it more clearly, I will draw a diagram here. So please look here carefully. So this was, let's say, a vesicle, a membrane bound vesicle. Inside it would be the secretory product. So it went here and it then fused with the cell membrane here. So as it fused with the cell membrane, then the secretory products, they were poured outside. So this process is called exocytosis. And this mode of secretion of the secretory product by a gland, this is called merocrine secretion. This is called merocrine secretion. Then, beside the merocrine secretion, we have another type of secretion, another mode of secretion, rather, I should say. So, here we have another example of cell, and this time, here, the secretory products, they are not packed into any vesicles, they are directly interspersed within the cytoplasm of the cell. Now, in this cell, there will be no exocytosis. In this cell, what will be happening is that the secretory products, they will gather at the top like this, and then this top part, this cap, this part of the cell, it will uh, pinch off, it will bud out, and then the fragments, these fragments will be released. A part of the cell as a fragments will be released. The top part of the cell as a fragment will be released containing these secretory products like this. So this mode of secretion is called apocrine secretion. So in apocrine secretion, the part of the cell, the apical part of the cell is typically lost. It is also said that the cell decapitate. The head is lost, so the cell decapitates. So after this decapitation, notice that this part of the cell is lost. So when more secretion is to be released, the cell will first repair itself. This part will be repaired. The cell will first repair itself, and another cycle of secretion will go on. And this type of secretion is called apocrine secretion. And then lastly, here we have another type of cell. Again, the secretory products are interspersed within the cytoplasm directly. Please understand that according to some authors, it is not always like this, that secretory product will not be membrane bound. Sometimes even in the apocrine, and this is called holocrine, by the way, in even in these type of cells, the secretory products may be membrane bonded, but typically they are not membrane bonded, but still sometimes they may be membrane bonded. So anyhow, in this situation, now the cell is actually filled with the secretory product. Now the secretory product will not gather on the top, and not the whole this top part, this part of the cell will not decapitate. Rather, whole this cell will fragment out, it will die out, right? And then these fragments will be containing the secretory products. Of course, some fragments will be containing the nucleus, some organelles, and some of the fragments will be containing the secretory product. So basically, in this case, the cell has sacrificed itself in order to provide the secretion. This mode of secretion in which whole cell is lost is called holocrine secretion. Now, some of you may be wondering that if the cell is lost, then how come more secretion will be released? Well, the answer to this is that typically such type of cells, they have high proliferative capacity. Not cells, I should say, such type of glands. Typically such type of glands, they have high proliferative capacity. So the cells on the top, secretory cells on the top, are lost. Then from the basal layers, more cells proliferate and specialize, and then they create the secretory products, and then they sacrifice themselves, they die out. And this process is called holocrine. So we have holocrine. Let me write it here briefly. So we have, this one is the most common mode of secretion, by the way. This is merocrine. This is apocrine, and this is holocrine. In merocrine, no part of the cell is lost, nothing is lost, the cell is intact. In apocrine, the top part is lost and it is repaired. The complete cell does not die out here. But in case of holocrine, the whole cell is sacrificed. So this whole cell die out, and this these fragments containing the dead cell particle as well as the secretory product, this as a whole act as the secretory product. The classical example is sebaceous gland. So why I told you whole this story in the lecture of sweat glands, the reason is that we have two types of sweat glands. One type of sweat glands are merocrine. Classically, they are known to be merocrine, and historically and classically, the other type of sweat glands, they have been known to be apocrine sweat glands. The merocrine sweat glands are more specifically named as eccrine sweat glands. Merocrine is the mode of secretion, but the specific name of such sweat gland is eccrine sweat glands, and apocrine sweat glands are called just apocrine sweat glands. Now here is the twist in the story. I told you that there are two types of cell, the apocrine and the merocrine sweat gland. Now you may be wondering that the merocrine or eccrine sweat gland, it's very logical that these type of sweat glands, they secrete the secretion through merocrine mechanism. Well, that's true and fair enough. And you may be wondering that apocrine sweat glands, they may be secreting their secretion by the apocrine mechanism of secretion of the secretory products. Well, the thing is that this is wrong. The apocrine sweat glands, they do not secrete the secretions via the apocrine mechanism. Rather, even the apocrine sweat glands secretes the secretion via the merocrine mechanism, merocrine mode of secretion. So, well, then the question is that why they are named as apocrine sweat glands. Well, initially it was thought, the initial research, even in some textbooks you will read that apocrine sweat glands, they secrete the secretions via the apocrine mechanism. So in the early days it was known, these apocrine sweat glands, they were known and they were thought to be releasing their products by apocrine mechanism. But now we know that they do not release the secretory products by apocrine mechanism, rather they secrete via the merocrine mechanism. But as a historical misnomer, we still use the name apocrine. And by the way, this aspect is still slightly controversial among the authors. Some very famous textbooks, they still say that apocrine sweat gland, they release their secretory products by apocrine mechanism. Even their latest edition, even they insist that they release the secretion via the apocrine mechanism. But anyhow, I will not go further into that debate. Our focus of lecture from this point onward will be about the development of these two types of sweat glands. So here I have a simplified 3D models that show a part of the skin. Along with that, I have also shown the hair follicle. So basically from the epidermis, this one is the epidermis. So from the stratum basale of epidermis of the skin, an invagination or solid ectodermal bud arises. Of course, as we have discussed earlier, the epidermis, it arises from the ectoderm. So anyhow, from this ectodermally originated epidermis, specifically from the stratum basale, a solid cord, or you can say solid bud, arises like this, and then it folds to form a coiled gland like this. Initially it's a complete solid rod, but what happens later that in the centers the cell die out. Within the center the cells begin to die out through the programmed cell death, apoptosis, and then the lumen is established. And of course, along with that, the cells at the periphery, they differentiate into myoepithelial cells. These myoepithelial cells have long processes and they cause the gland to squeeze and release the secretions outward into the duct. So then of course as I've told you, that lumen appears inside it, and that's all. So it's very easy. The embryology is not very difficult. In simple terms, whole this, it arises from the ectoderm. From the ectoderm, the skin forms, the epidermis forms. From the epidermis, the stratum basale, the bud arises, and this bud forms the solid cord, and this cord folds and coils, and then all cells of this gland, it's very easy, all cells of this gland, they arise from this bud, from this solid rod and solid cord, rather I should say, not rod, it's a solid cord. And even the myoepithelial cells, you may be thinking that myoepithelial cells, they arise from surrounding mesenchyme. No, they do not arise from surrounding mesenchyme, they arise directly from this ectoderm, right? And even the secretory cells, we have basically two types of secretory cells here, the clear cells and dark cells, but that is the topic of histology, so I will refrain from going into the details. And by the way, please understand that the secretory duct portion of this gland, it has the double layers, it has two layers, double layered epithelium, cuboidal epithelium, right? And now here we have a problem. The problem is that the duct ends here. The duct ends at the stratum basale. It does not go beyond. It should go outward into the skin. The gland should release its secretion into the skin, outside the skin, not into the skin, right? So what actually happens that from the stratum basale another bud arises, and that bud goes upward, and the cells in this region, they either die out, some of them they die out, and those who do not die out, they relocate at the sides, and here the place is managed for this gland. So here, when there is ample place here for this glandular duct to to form, then we have this spirally shaped glandular duct, and ultimately it pours the secretion out into the skin. So this is the pore, skin pore. So this gland is basically, this gland, it is directly pouring its secretion into the skin. This gland is the merocrine type of sweat gland, or more specifically it is called eccrine sweat gland. Eccrine sweat gland. Then we have another type of sweat gland, that is apocrine sweat gland, as I've told you earlier. So apocrine sweat gland, it arises not from the stratum basale but from the epithelium of the hair follicle. So from the hair follicular epithelium, another outward extension or outward cord similar to one we have discussed previously when discussing the merocrine or eccrine sweat gland. This cord arises like this, and again it coils, and internally it undergoes the process of apoptosis to form the lumen, and myoepithelial cells, they also develop, and then this gland develop. Now structurally both of these glands, they are very similar, but there are many differences that I will discuss. Structurally, the difference that you can see, that if you focus on the lumen, this one is a bit narrow lumen, and here whole of the cell, it has whole of the, not cell, whole of the gland, it has a wider lumen. Wider lumen, narrow lumen, wider lumen. Other thing is that the this one is more coiled and tortuous, especially the duct portion is highly coiled duct portion, and here the duct portion is less coiled, it is relatively straight. Here you can see this is the duct part, it is relatively straight, it is less coiled. So this gland is called apocrine gland, and it is directly opening into the hair follicle. Now both of these glands, they are simple tubular, and by tubular I mean this tubular shape. They have this tubular shape, simple tubular coiled gland. The other one maybe this is a tubular shape, the other one maybe they may be acinar like shape, or bigger one the alveolar shape, right? So these are, both of these are simple tubular coiled, and mostly both of them are unbranched, but sometime if we talk about apocrine, mostly they are unbranched, but sometime they may be branched. So sometime, mostly these are also mostly simple tubular coiled, but sometimes they may be branched tubular coiled, right? So understand this thing. Beside this exception that sometimes they may be branched, another exception may be there, that mostly they are opening into this hair follicle, especially this part is called pilosebaceous canal. This part, let me specifically show you, this part is called pilosebaceous canal because there is the sebaceous gland, some opening somewhat here, slightly lower to the opening of the apocrine gland. So somewhat here the sebaceous gland opens, and pylo means hair. So secretion of sebaceous gland as well as the hair, this hair, shaft of hair, both of them are lying in this pilosebaceous canal. So within the pilosebaceous canal, the secretions of apocrine sweat glands are released. This is typical of apocrine gland, but some exceptions are there. Sometime if the hair follicle is not there, sometime apocrine sweat gland, they may also directly open in the skin, into the surface of skin, just like the merocrine or eccrine sweat glands. And as a summary regarding the embryology, please understand both of them, they arise from ectoderm. Both of them arise from ectoderm. This one arises from epidermis, and specifically the stratum basale. I mean the eccrine arises from epidermis, stratum basale, but this one arises from the hair follicle, not from the epidermis or stratum basale, it arises from hair follicle. But of course, hair follicle as well as epidermis, they themselves arise from ectoderm. So in a nutshell, we can say that both of these glands, including the myoepithelial cells, both of these glands, they arise from ectoderm. So this was all about the development of the sweat glands. But before concluding the lecture, I would like to tell you a few differences between the eccrine and apocrine sweat glands. Now bear in mind that these differences are not very important from embryology point of view, but for the sake of concept and for the sake of histology and general concept, you must know at least some differences, because that is important, not from embryology but from general medical knowledge, general basics medical sciences knowledge, and from histology perspective. So if we talk about the structure, it's a bit of review as well. If we talk about structure, both of them are simple tubular, but here we will discuss about the differences, not the similarities. So one difference is that ecrine have narrow lumen and apocrine have wider lumen, as I've told you. And this one, their secretory duct part, it is highly coiled duct. Highly coiled duct. I have also shown you in the 3D model. This one is less coiled or less tortuous duct. This is the second difference. And then this one, it opens directly, typically directly opens directly outward in the skin surface, on the skin surface. And the apocrine gland, it does not open typically. Sometimes it does, but mostly it does not open directly on the skin surface, but opens in the pilosebaceous canal, or I can simply write it, it opens in the hair follicle. Yeah. This is the third difference. Now, this one is important. I have not told you the location or distribution. This type of gland, eccrine gland, it is present almost everywhere in the body, most part of the body. So, almost everywhere, especially concentrated in the soles and palms. But this gland, apocrine gland, it is not present everywhere. It is rather a bit more specialized. It is present mainly in the genital area and anal area, anogenital area, in the axilla, and in the areola of the breast region. There may be few more regions, but mainly these are the important ones. Yeah. And then after location, I would like to briefly talk about the secretions of these glands. Secretions. Now, the secretions of the eccrine gland, it is watery secretion with some salts. Basically, it is the filtrate from the blood. From the blood, these secretory cells, they filter the blood, and water, mostly the water is there, and some salts, and most of the salts are rather reabsorbed back, but some salts are still there. So hypotonic saline solution is there basically. So it is thin and watery secretion. It does not contain any proteins typically, or lipids. They are not usually present normally in the secretion of eccrine or merocrine sweat glands. Beside that, of course, there is some urea also secreted, some ammonia. So they have some secretory function as well, right? Yeah, and if we come here, apocrine, it is not thin and watery. Of course, it is hypotonic solution similar to the eccrine. Along with that, there are some other substances that are present. So it is viscous, thick or viscous, thick or viscous, and it contains proteins and lipids. Basic solution is the hypotonic solution similar to that, but within that solution we have proteins and lipids, right? And then we know that this one is orderless. Interestingly, initially this one is also orderless. Initially both are orderless, but here, because there are certain lipids present here, and some of these lipids, they are loved by our normal flora of bacteria. So some bacteria love these lipids and they try to break down lipids, and due to the bacterial action, the bacterial breakdown, they release some smell. So initially they are odorless, but as a result of bacterial action, the secretion ultimately it becomes smelly. Now I do not have much space here, so I will write it here. Or what I can do is that let me do something else. Let's move it here like this, and then we can write more differences here. So eccrine and apocrine. So regarding the function, the eccrine gland, they have mainly the thermoregulatory function, that if you are feeling very hot, there is hot environment, you will sweat a lot, and this sweating will cause cooling. The details will be discussed in physiology, not in this lecture. So thermoregulation is the function. Along with that, there is some excretory function, that some urea and some ammonia and some salts, they are also secreted via these glands, the eccrine or merocrine sweat glands. Regarding the function of apocrine sweat glands, they release pheromones in animals, which basically produce specific odor that attracts the opposite gender. But here in humans, typically the smell of your sweat, it does not attract the opposite gender. Mostly it causes the repulsion, and that is why the perfumes and deodorants exist. So exact function in human is not very well understood, to be honest. So this is a bit of question mark, I think. After the function, the eccrine sweat gland, they start working immediately after birth. Start working immediately after birth. But these apocrine glands, these are inactive till puberty. Then as the puberty arises, under the influence of sex hormones in both genders, then these glands, they become active and they start functioning. And I think that was all. Finally, regarding the origin, they arise, both of them, they arise from ectoderm. You know this, both of them arise from ectoderm. This one arise from stratum basale of epidermis, and the apocrine, they arise from hair follicle, epithelium of hair follicle. So that was all about the apocrine sweat gland and merocrine or eccrine sweat glands in human. Thank you so much for watching this video. Have a great day. Goodbye.